Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. May I say that I am very happy to have this opportunity to be here and to meet with you and to interact with the students and the faculty of Holmes Institute. My long tenure as an instructor or professor of the Institute has done a great deal for me as well, and I was so happy over the years to see the deepening of the interest and the increase of the enthusiasm of so many people in the classes for our subjects, so that I think we all may be very grateful to those who were involved in organizing the Holmes Institute and inspiring it and getting it going, as it were, among whom was my late friend and, I suppose I could call him employer, Obadiah Harris, who was the successor as the president of the Philosophical Research Society of Manly Hall, and I think it was Obadiah who conceived of the idea that there had to be an institute of greater academic scope and perhaps fame than had been before for the training of the ministers for the Church of Religious Science, and he really exerted himself most powerfully and valiantly, and he grabbed me sort of by the neck and said, "No, you got to do this too." I said, all right, what do I do? So we decided on these audio lessons, and they were given as public lectures in the upstairs lecture hall at the Philosophical Research Society on Los Feliz Boulevard, one after the other, and were recorded, and then these became the coursework which we have been using all of these years, and I must say it was it is a very fine experience for me to be able to interact with the students on our telephone conferences and otherwise. So it really turned out to be, I think, a very, very good project, and I'm very happy to have been a member of it from the beginning. I have taught and I'm teaching these two courses that were mentioned, one on the mystery tradition, really, if one wants to be more loquacious about it, you might say the mystery tradition of the Mediterranean spiritual matrix, and then in addition to that, Gnosticism, my chosen field and what really became my own tradition after I entered it. I know that we abstain from too much autobiographical material. There has been a great deal of biography just presented already, but it might be of some interest to you, as strange and almost incredible as it sounds, that I had my first Gnostic experience when I was 3 years old. Now, I wouldn't remember that I was 3 years old, but my mother, who has only passed away about 10 years ago, when I told her, she remembered the incident and she insisted that that was my age, and it was a dream. And the dream was of an image, I don't really describe to it in detail, which was of a very Gnostic nature and which sort of had to do with the presence of the dark, restrictive forces in the world that are trying to keep humanity from deeper insight, from enlightenment, and how one needs to overcome this particular difficulty. Very, very, very impressive dream. You know, I am also a very devoted student of C.G. Jung's psychology, and there is a category of dream that is mentioned in the books that is referred to as the big dream. And now, I always thought that was a heck of a trivial name to give such an important kind of dream, a big deal, you know. What is that? But in any event, the characteristics of the big dream are that it's very, very impressive, and that in essence and sometimes in great detail, it's the kind of dream that you never forget. And so that is certainly true. I can close my eyes and it was a fairly short dream, precisely as it occurred at that time. And then from that time on, as time went on, you know, by the age 4 or so, I was beginning to read, because my father was very intent to make me read, even as my mother was very intent on making me do mathematics, which I did not appreciate at all. And I always had very bad grades in mathematics, even though I had to go through, you know, everything, all the geometry and all of that in our schools. But soon I could read, and then wherever I was confronted with books, we lived out in the countryside in northern Hungary, and as you know, I think in the beginning, when I was really little, we didn't even have a radio. It was too much trouble to bother with the batteries and so forth, you know. In any event, reading. Everybody had books. Every educated person had a library. So I was constantly on the look for material on Gnostics, so that eventually I became one myself. After reading and studying for a good many years, although still as a very young man, about 16 years old, I actually met some live Gnostics, and they were pretty lively at that, in Belgium, who became very good friends of mine, and with whom I stayed in touch for quite a while, even if I was in America. And then I found out that there was a Gnostic church in France and Belgium, Germany, that was revived in the around the turn of the century of about 1880s, in the 1880s and so forth, and it was still functioning, and how so many of the Gnostic clergy and believers in France were executed by the Nazis and various things of that sort. So then, you know, I became a part of that particular matrix. Now, that's enough about that, and about moi, as we say in French. I think a very important thing to remember, especially for you folks who are within a particular spiritual matrix, or enunciated in modern times by Holmes, you know, really you might say a popular mystical school of modern times, that these efforts of various learned and insightful people that come up from time to time in history are only to a minor extent a new creation, that they always have two backgrounds, we might say. And if you visualize in the air the shape of two intersected lines, like a cross, then you might say that every spiritual endeavor, and subsequently maybe a spiritual school in the world, we shouldn't be really afraid of the word religion either, because it's really quite a good word. It means religio in Latin, to be joined back to something. joined back to something great. So while people may be disappointed with the various contemporary religions that they have been associated with, I think the term and the concept is a valuable one, so it really shouldn't be discarded. But what we have here with these two intersecting lines is that there is a dimension which diagrammatically would be the vertical line, which joins us to a transcendental dimension. So that at any given time we have as human beings the ability, if we exercise it, if we work on it, and if we remain faithful to it, to reach into the timeless eternity of transcendence. We have that capacity. Just because we have the capacity doesn't mean that we all exercise it or that we always exercise it, but we are capable of exercising it, which is very, very important. And that is, you might say, the symbolized as the vertical dimension. But then there is also a horizontal dimension. And the horizontal dimension is what, since we are in a Jewish institution, here I suppose we can mention that archetypal Jewish figure, Tevye, from the Fiddler on the Roof, who sings so powerfully, tradition, tradition, and that is tradition. Tradition means that which is handed down, something that goes on. So that when these two come together, the transcendental orientation and the transcendental experience on the one hand, and the tradition of a kindred nature which is already in existence, then you have a very good situation for your and other people's spiritual life. And so this has to be kept in mind. And because it is of an existential importance for each and every one of us. So for instance, as there is an increasingly fine literature on the subject, I don't know whether, I'm always pushing books because I've been reading books all my life. There is a gentleman who is a friend of mine, has become a friend of mine, who is a fabulous historian and an extremely lucid writer, lives in New York. His name is Mitch Horowitz. Have you encountered him? Good. Well, he has just the latest thing that he has written many, many books, but the latest thing that he put together, which I think is also worth considering, are all the writings, large and small, of the late Manly Palmer Hall that relate to the United States of America. The Secret History of America, Mitch called it. It's a marvelous collection. If he hadn't done that, I would say about 1/4 to 20% of that material would have been lost, because he got it out of journals, he got it off recorded lectures, all kinds of unusual places, in addition to the published material that some of us were, of course, familiar with. It's a very, very wonderful work. But another very wonderful work of his probably concerns you folks more directly, and I think that the main title of that book is One Simple Idea. And this is the history in depth of the New Thought metaphysical movement in America from its very beginnings, even before the time of the American Revolution. I mean, going way, way back with Phineas Quimby and, all the old boys and girls, a lot of girls among them, by gum, and it's really very, very, very well done and very interesting. So that is a, let's say, a documentation of this particular tradition, that while of course it has had connections elsewhere in Europe with Franz Anton Mesmer and all kinds of people, but it's an American phenomenon, an American tradition. And some of the features of the New Thought movement, of which of course you are a part, and I might say, having read your founders' writings and so forth, it's one of the clearest and best statements of the New Thought metaphysical tradition, religious science. Very, very fine material. And so this is an important thing. But there also one needs to recognize that all of this comes from somewhere. I have a kind of a little trite saying that I don't know whether you agree with, that if something doesn't come from somewhere, then it is probably not going anywhere either. So there has to be a prehistory, even as we as individual human beings have a past. There has to be a prehistory that leads up to the present and moves into the future. And so I became largely concerned with, and I was certainly inspired in that direction once I knew him and I started working for him by Manly Palmer Hall, that it is very important to have some knowledge, both intellectual and deeper spiritual knowledge, of the tradition of which we are a part, and see that what we are interested in and what we are studying and what we are practicing in our churches is not, it hasn't been invented overnight. It's not just a flower that blooms in the spring, tra-la, as the song has it, but it's like one of these magnificent old trees that we have here. It's been here for a long time, or maybe the giant sequoias up in our California mountains, which you stand in front of them and you see that, this tree stood at the time of Jesus Christ already, and things of that sort. And that is the stream of the transcendental, the mystical tradition of which you are a part and I am a part. So at the same time we have to cultivate our transcendental connection, but also to be involved in the stream that started, of the stream of the living waters that started long ago and far away, but that never disappeared, and was always here, ready to nourish and still the spiritual thirst of those who found their way to it. Now, we might jump around a little bit in the sequence now, and I'll share with you a sort of a little image. I have a diagram of it in one of my books, as to really how the religious spiritual impulse comes to humanity and how it works. And there you may envision, if you can, a circle, and at the top of the circle we place a point, and that point is obviously the beginning. And what is the beginning of spirituality? What is the beginning of religion? What is the beginning of that kind of a tradition? It is experience. Somewhere, somehow, somebody or some group of somebodies had an extraordinary experience. They stepped off the rim of the world and walked into another reality. Now, not in the science fiction fashion, which is a metaphor really for these sorts of things. I have a friend who, when he was quite young, who said to me, I said, that his religion was Star Trek. Well, I said, Bob, I can understand that, because it shows shows the other realities, albeit, of course, in a physical, in a dramatic fashion. But so the extraordinary, the non-ordinary reality is experienced by someone, and this someone or group of someones then have an idea that it should be carried forward, that their insight, their vision should not be lost. And so they usually at first do an oral transmission. They gather their disciples together and they tell them verbally what kind of experience they had to the best of their ability. And then, of course, they go the way of all flesh. But the second generation now has the transmission. And maybe the second or the third or the fourth generation, there comes about a feeling on the part of these people, gee, folks, if we don't somehow write this down, by then there is some writing available, then it will be lost. And then they write it down. The oral transmission changes into a literary tradition. And that is how the sacred scriptures of the world start. And that goes for a while, and the people are happy with these scriptures. But as the generations pass, people come along who change these scriptures considerably. They don't understand the intangible and yet so tremendously important mystical core of this transmission. And therefore they change, they try, they are sincere for the most part. But they change the message and they materialize it. They make it physical. They now engage in the communication of concept and precept, intellectual things and directives to be done or not done. How come the commandments? You have to do this and you don't have to do that. I think it was Bertrand Russell, the British philosopher. I still had a little bit of contact with him when Lord Russell was alive, who said, and he was a pretty ironic-minded gentleman. He said, there are different religions, different kinds of religions in the world. There are be-religions, religions that concentrate on being, like Hinduism and Buddhism. And then there are do-religions who concentrate on doing, on action, like Judaism. And then there are don't religions like Christianity. So, I don't necessarily join that position, but I think it was a clever witticism of an old Englishman. In any event, that's the sort of thing that happens. So it has become a matter of belief now. We have articles of belief. This is what you have to believe in, and this is what you have to do and not do. And I'm sorry to say that, at least in my opinion, That's pretty much where the majority of the big religions get stuck. They don't move from that. Now, of course, they are all based on in a mythic background, a story background. I think Joseph Campbell, our great American mythologist, said, and a lot of people didn't like that, he said that religion, or most religion, I would say, that religion is really just misunderstood mythology. It's true. So that is still there in the background. And so people catch on to the more exciting, the transformative, the mysterious mythos at the back of commandment and at the back of dogma. And that those are the mystics that pop up like flowers in a field throughout history. You know, we know the great Christian mystics and mystics of other religions. Every religion has them, although very often they are they have a difficult position within the religion. Certainly, there was a long time in Christendom when the officials of the religion, of the church, couldn't make up their minds about these mystics as to whether they should canonize them and make them saints or whether they should burn them at the stake. And in some cases they did both. You know, one whom they did that to was poor Saint Joan of Arc of France. You know, I mean, this was a little girl, you know, an incredible visionary, and she was burnt at the stake, although pretty soon thereafter she was declared a saint. So, you know, those things happen, because that's when that vertical dimension reasserts itself. Even though there is the heavy weight of dogma and the heavy weight of commandments, yet there are some who are able to rise out of that and work their way to something else, to something deeper, to something, well, to that which transcends all of these lower things. So that is how things go for a long time. And then there are always a minority of people who get together and who say, you know, we have a strong feeling and knowledge that this started with experience. We also want to have that experience. And so they develop spiritual disciplines, they develop magical, mystical rites, they work in the direction of having a transcendental experience again. They are not satisfied with the mundane things that the religion, the official religion, dishes out to them. And then they eventually have such. New insights develop, new wisdom. And in so doing, they are able to see the similarity between their new mystical experience and the original experience that gave rise to the tradition of which they are a part. And when they are able to combine these two in a helpful, in a meaningful fashion, then we have a new dispensation, which, however, is the outcome of a tradition. And this tradition has been called esoteric often, which means interior, as against exoteric or outer. And it just so happened, and it still is the case, that in any given culture, in any given time of history, the The exoteric has a much larger following than the esoteric. The reasons for that are psychological and historical, and they would take a lot of analysis and wouldn't do us all that much good. But so there we have the, you might say, we always have the majority religion and then the minority tradition. In some cultures, that worked out quite nicely. And that is why I have chosen to do one of the courses that I have the privilege of presenting to you, namely the mystery tradition, in this case of the Mediterranean world. Because at the time of the Greeks, the time of even much of ancient Egypt, the time of the Greeks, the time of the Romans, the time of the ancient Persians and Mediterranean, Middle Eastern peoples, there was a very, very nice arrangement. The majority of the people had their popular beliefs. The gods and the goddesses, and who were for the most part, at least among the Greeks, a pretty happy bunch. The Greek gods and goddesses were happy, and you know, there are such lovely little vignettes, you know, of folk custom and belief. When the Greeks walked around on in the Greek islands, but particularly one where they could see the mountains. Greece is a very mountainous country, and so up on the mountaintop they envisioned Mount Olympus. That is where the gods and the goddesses are. And when they walked by, there's a crowd enveloped mountaintops, a little bit like it was here today, looking around, you know. And they said, the old people would tell the young ones, okay guys, listen. Can you hear them laugh? Can you hear the laughter from the mountaintop? And of course many of them did. That is, the gods are laughing. Because they were the happy gods. They had a sense of humor. Not a very common commodity in religion, as probably has not escaped your notice in the course of your life. So it was, and the Romans have inherited that, because the Romans were just a transmogrified Greeks, really. Their own myths of Aeneas coming from his ships from Greece to the peninsula, you know, the Italian peninsula, tell the story. They were really, they were very, very close descendants of the Greeks. But so they had an arrangement that the majority of the people were enjoying the world of the happy gods. They made their sacrifices. They had beautiful festivals throughout the year, you know, with big celebrations, gorgeous processions, the people with flowers and wreaths in their hair and carrying banners and singing and laughing and so forth. You know, that was the religion of the majority of the people, the religion of the state. But then there was something else. No doubt much fewer people availed themselves of it, but it was not only not looked down upon, but it was looked upon with very great reverence and interest, and those were the mysteries, as they call them. I'm always opposed to the sort of 19th century expression of the mystery schools, because these were not schools. They didn't have little red schoolhouses in LFCs, you know. But they were institutions of the mysteries, which comes from the Greek word mystes, which means covering your eyes. In other words, you withdraw your attention from the outer world, from the extroverted world, as we call it psychologically nowadays, and you look for something else. You look for that which transcends the outer world, the physical world, the mundane world. And moreover, they had institutionalized these in a very beautiful way. The biggest, the longest lasting, the most famous of the mysteries, the Eleusinian, according to fairly conservative estimates, existed for about 5,000 years. Now that's about as long as much of the religion and civilization of Egypt existed, who had their own mysteries. And in these mysteries worked out procedures. They had their own priesthood who know how to do that, and they would guide and lead the people who came to be initiated into the mysteries to have their own transcendental experience. These experiences were almost inevitably based on the mythos of a particular deity or a set of deities. For instance, the Eleusinian mysteries were based on the story of Persephone, also known as Kore the girl, and her mother, and their interactions and the way they go down into the underworld and all of these things, and the experiences that they have, to put it very briefly. And the experiences through which the mystery priesthoods guided their initiates were, it would seem, for the most part so powerful that the people who came out of there were never the same again. Cicero, who was, the Roman orator and politician, so certainly not a mystical man as such, Cicero said that the Eleusinian mysteries, for instance, were the greatest ennobling influence that came to bear on humanity in known history, because the people who came out of there were changed in such a magnificent way. And this went on for a considerably long time. Now, this is not to say that the Greek civilization or the Roman civilization or the ancient Persian civilization were something totally wonderful, and there were a lot of problems. One of them was slavery, which we hear a lot about now. So the American civilization is not the only one. It was a great civilization, but it had a millstone around its neck in the beginning, slavery, of which there is a lot of talk now, and so did the ancient world. Now, it's part of the general syndrome that the mysteries really taught, that, you don't have light without shadow. You don't have good things without bad things. That life in this world is a mixture. And the more extroverted, the more outer-directed your life is, the more this mixture is going to buffet you around. You're attracted to things that are nice, and you run toward them, and then something nasty catches up with you, and it's a sort of like a ping pong ball. You're bouncing around between the nice and the not so nice. But there is something that is beyond nice and not nice. Friedrich Nietzsche, who was a weird guy, but I like him nevertheless. He was more of a poet than a philosopher, but since I was bilingual as a child already, and I went to Hungarian school and German language school, so my German is still quite good. And I love the German language. I think it's it's the most magnificent literature and poetry in German. So Nietzsche wrote, called it Beyond Good and Evil. Well, that can be regarded in various ways, but there is a mystical meaning to that. Because when you, in your consciousness, you rise out of and away from, even though temporarily, maybe only for a few minutes every once in a while, out of the interaction, the tussle of good and evil, and you are not, your consciousness is not over there being buffeted by these influences. You are above it. Not so very long ago, I had a dream, not as big a dream as Dr. Martin Luther King, but another one, wherein I was with a late friend of mine who just died not very long ago, who was an Episcopal priest in the state of New York and also a Jungian analyst at the same time. And so the two of us were on a sort of a plateau, like a roof, somewhat translucent. And down below us, as we were able to look down, were all these people jumping around, wrestling, hitting each other, making all kinds of noises, a rather unpleasant scene. And so the two of us were talking, we understood each other, very well, and said, see, this is what we have to do. We have to be in a place that is above these things. If we were down there, we would be just like these people who are punching each other and yelling and acting like fools. But since we are up here, we have a distance from that. And that really has been one of the great effects of the esoteric, of the mystical tradition. That in consciousness, in mind, as the New Thought tradition often called it, which is an okay and sometimes not so okay translation from the Greek, from the Hermetic tradition. The ancients, Hermetics, Gnostics, Neoplatonists, those were the three that came later on. They had a Greek word for an aspect, a functional unit of consciousness that they called nous, N-O-U-S, in Greek letters. And this nous is the connection between the lesser self or human personality and the spirit. It's sort of a bridge. Now, this is the word that has been translated by, particularly in the Victorian era, by some of the translators as mind. And it is that term that has been taken over by the New Thought tradition. However, I found the difficulty, and you may find that too, and maybe you pay some attention to it so you can correct it as ministers and others, that what the New Thought metaphysical tradition calls mind is not the thinking principle. It's not just reasoning, because reasoning only goes so far. I had a teacher, God rest his soul, the late Professor Ernest Wood, who lived in India for 30 years or something like that, was a prominent theosophist and a very wise man. And he used to say, you have to remember that thinking only leads to more thinking. Yeah? Because you can keep on spinning your wheels, and I think it's better than being a thoughtless person, but it doesn't really go anywhere. So there has to be something beyond thinking. Of course, the ancient picture of categorizations of the inner nature of the human was that there are certain levels. There is the physical with the senses, sensation. Then there is the emotion, the feeling. Then there is the thinking. And then there is, if you find it, there is the bridge that leads from the higher kind of thinking, the more impersonal thinking leads to the spirit. And that is the nous, the mind, or what that has been called the mind. And that, see, these are helpful concepts whereby we can understand our functioning a little bit better. And we come to realize that no matter how intense our sensations may be, no matter how intense our emotions may be, that's not all there is. And no matter how powerful our reasoning may be, that is not all there is. And when you add all of these together, it is still not all there is. There is something else. And moreover, that if the human does not make contact with that bridge, doesn't start at least walking on that bridge that leads from the lesser self, from the personality to the spirit, life has not been worthwhile. The purpose, the real purpose of life has not been fulfilled. You can have a vast number of sensations, you can experience a tremendous number of emotions, you can be thinking like a computer, and you still have not gotten to where you are supposed to get. And in order to facilitate that, to stimulate that, to lead people onto the bridge, the Eleusinian priesthood, the mysteries of Orpheus, of Dionysus, a whole bunch of them. That's all they were. That's all they were really directed toward, and they all had a little different method, but they were all leading to that transcendental contact, that transcendental vision, which then really fulfills life. Now, that is why I chose to have a class on the mysteries, because I firmly hold that the mysteries were the beginning of the esoteric tradition. It was esoteric already at the time of Greece and so forth, but it was institutional. The Eleusinian mysteries, for instance, which are really the most famous, anybody who was not guilty of the crime of murder was eligible to be initiated into the mystery. So you could have been a thief, you could have cheated on your wife, you could have cheated on your husband. After all, that's what the gods and the goddesses were doing, So it was kind of a lifestyle situation. You could do all kinds of things that we consider reprehensible in other culture, but the important thing was to make the breakthrough to that spiritual point. But then something happened, and I don't even know how our time is going.
We have about 5 or 10 more minutes before we get to questions.
Okay, good. And you see how the time flies. How the time flies when I'm with you, you know. I know the old songs. That's what in any event, just very, very quickly, what then happened was that with the coming of new religions that came out of the Middle East, primarily the monotheistic religions, the mysteries went away. And the popular religiosity of the Roman empires was taken over by the Christians, and the esoteric tradition eventually had to go underground. But there was about a 400-year period from the time of 1 AD, or the beginning of the Common Era, when there was still a lot of activity of an esoteric nature, which came to apply and translate the insights of the mysteries into the new context. And the people who did this sort of thing were referred to in Greek, which was the educated language, as toi gnostikoi, those who know, these knowing folk. And that is where the Gnostic tradition comes in. So the Gnostic tradition was the one grand attempt to take the tradition of the mysteries and to bring them into the new zodiacal age, the Piscean age at that time, and to somehow practice them within the context of the new religion. For which reason the Gnostics were, the people whom we refer to as Gnostics, were Christians. But they were different kind of Christians from the other Christians, because they felt that they were seeking an inner spiritual knowingness, the knowledge of the Spirit, the same sort of thing that the mysteries pursued earlier. And then there were a couple of others around who were not Christians, because after all, the first couple of centuries, there were still a lot of pagans running around. And they were the Neoplatonists, who were using the mystical side of the philosophy of the great Plato, and the Hermeticists. They were all teaching and doing really the same thing. And then as history went on, they often had to go underground, they re-emerge again, and some of us adhering to that tradition and with the rediscovery of our scriptures of Gnostics, you know, well, here we are. I don't want to sound very egotistical, but we are back. we are back.